The early morning air inside the naval base felt still, almost heavy, as the first rays of sunlight touched the long rows of barracks. The hallways were quiet except for the faint hum of ceiling fans and the soft shuffle of boots from soldiers preparing for their day. Among them, moving slowly and quietly with a mop in hand, was a woman no one paid much attention to. She wore plain gray work clothes, her hair tied back neatly, and on her face, the calm, steady expression of someone just doing a simple cleaning job. She pushed her mop across the polished floor, wringing it out in a metal bucket from time to time, and when people passed her, she would smile politely and step aside. To anyone looking, she was just the new janitor assigned to keep the place clean. But under that calm exterior, her mind was sharp and alert. She wasn't here only to clean. Every day, she scanned her surroundings without making it obvious. She noticed the small details: who walked together, who avoided eye contact, which doors were left slightly open, and which conversations ended abruptly when someone else came near. Her eyes, trained over years of service, caught things most people would miss. No one around her knew she had once been part of the Navy's most elite unit. No one knew about the missions she had completed in distant places, the languages she had learned, or the countless times she had been in situations where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. Now, instead of holding a weapon, she was holding a mop. It was all part of her mission. The orders she had received were simple, but the reason behind them was not. There had been whispers, nothing official, just a few small pieces of information, that something unusual was happening inside the base. Certain supplies had gone missing. A few classified files had been accessed at odd hours. Nothing large enough to sound alarms, but enough to make the higher-ups nervous. Whoever was behind it knew how to stay hidden. That was why they sent her. Her cover as a janitor was perfect. People didn't think twice about cleaners. They came in, did their job quietly, and left. Soldiers would walk right past her, speaking freely about their day, or even complaining about orders, never realizing she understood every word, and sometimes even in more than one language. Her job was to watch, to listen, and to piece together a puzzle without drawing attention. That morning, as she mopped the hallway outside the dorm rooms, she could hear faint laughter from inside one of the rooms. It wasn't unusual. Young soldiers often joked around before training. But in between the laughter, she caught a few words in a different language, a language that didn't belong here. Her hands kept moving, but her mind stored the sound like a recorded clip. It wasn't enough to act on, not yet. Still, it was a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, important things could hide. The job itself wasn't easy. Cleaning an entire barracks was physically tiring. The hallways were long, the floors had to be spotless, and there was always the smell of disinfectant in the air. But she didn't complain. Every sweep of the mop was part of her disguise. If she worked with quiet dedication, she would remain invisible, and the mission could continue. Now and then, a few soldiers would greet her. Some would nod politely, others would give a quick smile, and a few wouldn't notice her at all. She never took offense. Being unnoticed was her goal. Once, a young private even joked about how she was the fastest mop in the West Wing, and she responded with a light laugh, as if she were just happy to be part of the background. By mid-morning, the base began to wake fully. The sound of boots striking the floor grew louder, orders echoed down the halls, and the smell of coffee drifted from the mess hall. She paused to wring out the mop again, her eyes casually scanning a bulletin board nearby. Most of it was routine, training schedules, shift changes, meal hours. But in the corner, she noticed a small handwritten note pinned up without any official stamp. It simply read, "Meeting, 1,400 hours, East Storage." She didn't stare at it for long. She couldn't risk anyone seeing her interest. Instead, she gave the mop another twist and continued down the hall. She had learned long ago that patience was everything. In her old missions, rushing in too soon often meant missing the bigger picture. Now, the barracks themselves were her field of operation. Every hallway was like a street she had to patrol. Every face she passed was a potential lead. And even though she appeared to be cleaning, her mind was always working, quietly connecting dots, remembering voices, and keeping track of who went where. Outside, sunlight was getting stronger, shining through the tall windows and casting sharp lines of shadow across the floor. She worked her way toward the end of the hall, where a set of large double doors led to a storage area. She glanced through the small glass pane, saw nothing unusual, and moved on. But she remembered the note. As she passed by a group of soldiers heading toward the training field, she heard one of them mention that a big inspection was coming soon. That wasn't unusual either. High-ranking officers often visited bases without much warning. Still, something about the tone caught her attention, a mix of nervousness and excitement. She stored that piece of information away as well. By the time her first shift ended, her mop had covered nearly every inch of the main barracks. Her bucket was empty, her hands smelled faintly of soap, and her back ached just enough to remind her that this was real work. But she didn't mind. She stepped into the janitor's closet, set her supplies neatly in place, and took a slow breath. So far, her cover was holding. No one suspected her. But deep down, she knew things were about to change. In her line of work, patterns didn't stay the same for long. Something was coming, maybe that inspection, maybe something else entirely. Whatever it was, she would be ready. As she left the building, the sound of a helicopter in the distance broke the quiet. It was a deep, steady thump that seemed to echo in the air. She glanced toward the landing pad far away and saw a small group gathering. Even from this distance, she could tell this wasn't a routine visit. She didn't know yet what it meant, but her instincts told her it was connected to why she was here. Tomorrow would bring new clues, new challenges, and maybe even a turning point. But for now, she walked away quietly, just another worker finishing her day. No one could guess that the woman with the mop had once worn the uniform of an elite soldier, and that her mission had only just begun. The next morning began like any other. The sun had just started to warm the base, and the barracks were still quiet except for the low hum of early activity. She arrived with her mop and bucket, moving with the same unhurried pace, her eyes scanning without looking like she was scanning. To anyone passing by, she was just there to clean. But inside, her thoughts were turning over what she had seen and heard yesterday. The handwritten note about the East storage meeting, the talk about a big inspection, and that helicopter she had spotted in the distance. None of it was proof of anything, but together, they formed a picture that didn't feel like coincidence. As she worked her way down the main corridor, the base felt different. It wasn't obvious, not like alarms or rushing soldiers, but there was an edge in the air. More officers than usual were walking around, and some of them carried folders under their arms. A few glanced at her in passing, but their eyes quickly moved on. She gave them a polite nod, keeping her head down. Near the far end of the hall, she spotted two soldiers speaking in low voices near a doorway. She caught only fragments of their words, "Better be ready," and "They said he's arriving today," before they noticed her approaching. Their conversation stopped instantly. They stepped aside, pretending to check something on a clipboard, while she rolled her mop bucket past them without a word. She didn't look back, but she could feel their eyes following her until she turned the corner. Moments like that were small, but she had learned long ago to pay attention to what people didn't say as much as to what they did. Her route eventually took her near the East storage area, the same location mentioned on that handwritten note. She slowed just slightly as she approached, glancing at the large metal doors. They were closed, but she could see a faint line of light at the bottom, meaning the lights inside were on. She didn't stop to investigate. That would break her cover. Instead, she made a mental note of the time. If this meeting was real, she might be able to be nearby without raising suspicion later. By mid-morning, the pace of the base picked up even more. She heard footsteps quickening, doors opening and closing, and the sound of voices coming from the courtyard. It was clear something important was happening. She wrung out her mop one last time, deciding to make her way toward the main entrance of the barracks. That's when she saw them. A group of officers had gathered in the distance, their uniforms pressed to perfection. Standing among them was a man who clearly wasn't part of the regular barrack staff, a tall, commanding figure with the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs without thinking. Even from across the hall, she could tell this was the general they had been talking about. Her heart rate didn't change, her expression didn't shift, but inside, her instincts sharpened. High-ranking visits were always significant, but they could mean very different things: a morale boost, an inspection, or, in some cases, a quiet investigation. She had to find out which one this was. She moved to a spot near the far wall, busying herself with mopping, but keeping him in her peripheral vision. The general was speaking to a few officers, his voice low but steady. Then a man standing just behind him said something in Arabic, a dialect she recognized instantly. It was a simple phrase, casual on the surface, but the fact that it was spoken here, in this setting, caught her off guard. She had spent enough time overseas to know the sound of the language, the rhythm of the words. It wasn't common on this base, especially not in the middle of an English conversation. Her grip on the mop handle tightened just slightly, but she kept moving it across the floor as if nothing had happened. Her mind, however, was racing. She needed to hear more, but she couldn't risk making it obvious. The man's voice faded as the group began to move toward the command office. She finished mopping the section she was on and slowly worked her way back toward the storage area. The timing was close to the one she had noted earlier. If the meeting mentioned in that note was real, it might be happening now. As she reached the corner, she noticed the metal doors to the storage room were still closed. But now there were faint sounds from inside, voices, a shuffle of papers, and the low hum of a fan. She didn't linger. She walked past as if on her way to the supply closet, her mop bucket wheels squeaking softly. She didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but the pieces were starting to form a pattern. The inspection, the Arabic words, the secretive meeting, they were connected somehow. And she was right in the middle of it, hidden in plain sight. By the time her shift ended, the base felt even more charged with energy. She left quietly, pushing the bucket toward the janitor's closet, her thoughts locked on what tomorrow might bring. She didn't know it yet, but the next time she crossed paths with the general, nothing about her cover would remain the same. The next day arrived with a restless energy in the air. Even before she stepped into the barracks, she could feel it. The base wasn't moving at its usual rhythm. It was sharper, more deliberate, as if everyone knew something important was about to happen. She picked up her mop and bucket like always, her steps steady, her expression calm. But inside, she was reading the room, the quick glances between soldiers, the way conversation stopped when certain people walked past, the small but noticeable increase in security presence. The general's visit hadn't been just a formality. It had shifted the atmosphere. Her first task was the east hallway, the longest stretch in the building. The floor was smooth and cool under her mop, the smell of disinfectant filling the air. As she worked, she could hear distant voices carrying from the main entrance. She couldn't make out the words yet, but the tone was formal, low, controlled, respectful. The general was here again. She kept mopping, pretending not to notice, but her ears tracked the sound as it moved closer. Heavy footsteps, the distinct click of polished boots on tile, and the soft murmur of officers trying to keep pace with him. She turned her body slightly so her face was away from a group, focusing on the mop strokes. Her head tilted just enough to catch every word without making it obvious. Then she heard it again, Arabic. This time, it was the same man from yesterday, speaking in that familiar dialect, the kind she hadn't heard in years, not since her deployments. His tone was casual, but there was weight in the words. She caught a few phrases that hinted at something more than small talk. It was subtle, hidden between polite exchanges in English, but she knew enough to recognize when someone was testing boundaries. She didn't move faster or slower. She simply kept cleaning, letting the mop glide back and forth while her mind sharpened around the sound of those words. The group was getting closer now. She could hear the general's voice clearly, speaking about readiness and discipline, his words echoing down the hall. And then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. "Good morning," the general said. His voice was directed at her. She looked up, meeting his eyes just briefly before lowering her gaze again in the respectful way anyone in her position might. "Morning, sir," she replied softly. There was a pause. Then, almost as if it were an afterthought, the general smiled slightly and said something in English about how hard she was working. It was the kind of polite acknowledgement you give to someone you think you're meeting for the first time. And that's when she made her choice. Without missing a beat, she answered him, in fluent, precise Arabic. The sound of the language, so unexpected in that moment, seemed to freeze the air around them. The officers behind him stopped mid-step. Even the man who had spoken Arabic earlier shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing in sudden interest. Her words were simple, respectful, the kind you would say to a superior officer in a formal setting. But she also placed one small, carefully chosen phrase within the sentence, a phrase known only to a specific network of operatives. It was subtle, quick, gone in an instant, but enough to change the entire conversation without anyone else realizing why. For a moment, the general just looked at her. It wasn't a look of surprise exactly, more like recognition. "You speak Arabic?" he asked, switching back to English. She gave a small, humble nod. "A little, sir." His expression didn't give away much, but his tone changed slightly, becoming lower, more measured. "I see." He didn't press further. Instead, he simply gave a nod, as if filing the moment away for later, and moved on with his entourage. But as they walked past, she caught the faintest glance from him over his shoulder, one that told her he now knew she was not what she seemed. The rest of the day, her work continued as usual, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, wiping down surfaces. But inside, she knew something had shifted. That short exchange had drawn a quiet line between her and the general, a silent acknowledgement that they understood something the others didn't. And it wouldn't stay silent for long. That night, the base seemed quieter than usual, but she knew better than to believe it. The quiet was only on the surface. Beneath it, things were shifting. She had seen the way the general's eyes had changed when she spoke to him in Arabic. She had noticed how the man standing behind him, the one who had spoken the language earlier, had stiffened ever so slightly, his expression guarded. It wasn't just a passing surprise. Something had clicked in that moment, and whatever it was already in motion. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. The air was cool, the hallways still empty. She used those first few minutes to walk the barracks with her mop and bucket, as if getting a head start on her work, but really she was checking for signs. She didn't have to wait long to notice the first one. Two unfamiliar men in plain clothes stood at the far end of the hallway, speaking quietly with one of the senior officers. Their presence wasn't normal. They didn't move like regular base staff. They moved like people who were used to watching others without being noticed. Later, as she was cleaning near the command office, she overheard two soldiers talking about the visitor not staying long. One mentioned that the general had been in several closed-door meetings since yesterday, and none of the usual staff were invited in. The other shrugged it off, but she knew those details mattered. This wasn't just an inspection, it was a targeted visit, and she was now part of it whether she had intended to be or not. By mid-morning, she caught sight of the general again. He was walking down the corridor with the same man who had spoken Arabic earlier. The two of them seemed to be in a serious discussion. She didn't linger, but as she passed them, she could feel the man's eyes on her, measuring her. It was a strange position to be in. Her mission had been to stay invisible, to gather information quietly. But now, by speaking those few words yesterday, she had put herself on their radar. That could be a risk, or it could be the breakthrough she needed. Her instincts told her to wait, to let them make the next move. And they did. Late in the afternoon, she was mopping near the east storage area again when the double doors suddenly opened. Two officers stepped out, followed by one of the plainclothes men she had seen earlier. They stopped talking when they saw her. One of them gave a polite nod before locking the doors behind them and walking away. She knew something had happened inside that room. She could almost feel it in the air, the same tense stillness she had experienced in past missions just before action was taken. As she finished up her shift, she caught a brief glimpse through a window near the courtyard. The general was there, standing alone for a moment before heading toward the administration building. He looked calm, but there was a purpose in his steps, like a man who had just confirmed something important. She didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but she was sure of one thing. Her time blending into the background was almost over. The next morning carried a tension you could almost touch. The air in the barracks felt heavier, conversations were shorter, and people were moving with more purpose than usual. She could sense that whatever had been quietly building was close to breaking the surface. She began her shift the same way she always did, mop in one hand, bucket in the other, keeping her pace unhurried, her expression neutral. But inside, she was running through every detail she had gathered over the last few days. The hidden meeting in the East storage room, the unfamiliar men in plain clothes, the Arabic conversations that didn't belong here, and the general's quiet but unmistakable acknowledgement of her yesterday. It didn't take long for the day's rhythm to change. Around mid-morning, she noticed more movement near the central hallway, officers coming and going quickly, the general walking with two senior staff members. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't here to boost morale. He was here for something far more serious. She was halfway through mopping a section near the barracks common room when she heard the sound of boots approaching, firm, deliberate steps. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The general stopped a few feet from her. "Would you mind pausing for a moment?" he asked. His tone was polite, but there was weight in it. She placed the mop back in the bucket and straightened slightly. "Of course, sir." He glanced around at the others in the hallway. "Clear the room," he ordered. His voice carried authority, and within seconds, the few soldiers nearby had stepped out, leaving the space oddly quiet. Only the general, two officers, and the man who had spoken Arabic before remained. The general studied her for a moment. "You've been working here for how long?" "Just a few days," she replied evenly. He nodded once, then switched languages without warning. Arabic. The words were direct, not small talk this time. "Who sent you here?" he asked. She didn't flinch. She answered in the same language, her voice calm but deliberate. "The same people who sent you." It was a gamble, but the look in his eyes told her she had chosen correctly. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly not understanding the exchange. The man behind the general, however, narrowed his eyes even further, studying her as though trying to place her face in a memory. The general gave a slow, knowing nod. "I see," he said in English. Then, to his men, "She's with us. No one else needs to know more than that." The officers exchanged quick, puzzled glances, but they didn't question him. Turning back to her, the general lowered his voice. "We've been monitoring a situation here for weeks. I suspect you've seen signs of it already." She gave a small nod. "I have." "Good," he said, "because it's going to come to a head today." And just like that, the conversation ended. The general stepped back, the others following, and they disappeared down the corridor, leaving her alone once again with her mop and bucket. But now, everything was different. The room no longer saw her as invisible. The general had just marked her as part of the operation. Whatever happened next, she would no longer be watching from the sidelines. The rest of that day felt different from all the days before. She could sense it in every hallway she passed, in the way people spoke in shorter sentences, in the unusual stillness that would suddenly settle over a group before moving on again. Something was about to happen. She could feel it in her bones. By late afternoon, the shadows were stretching across the courtyard outside. The base had an odd quiet to it, the kind that comes right before a storm. She was in the east wing, slowly pushing her mop along the polished floor, when a faint voice crackled over the radio of a nearby guard. He moved instantly, speaking into his mic, his expression tightening. Two other soldiers appeared from the hallway, walking with purpose toward the direction of the east storage area. She didn't follow, not directly. Instead, she made her way around, taking a longer route that led her past the back corridor leading toward the same place. As she drew near, she saw them, two plainclothes men and the general himself, standing just outside the storage doors. The man who had spoken Arabic earlier was there too, his hands behind his back, his face calm but unreadable. One of the plainclothes men stepped forward and spoke quietly to the general. A few seconds later, the door opened, and a soldier was led out between two guards. His face was pale, his jaw tight. She recognized him from earlier in the week, one of the officers who always seemed to linger near conversations that didn't involve him. There was no shouting, no scene, just a quiet, efficient removal, The kind of operation that left the rest of the base with more questions than answers. Within minutes, the group moved out of sight, taking the detained man with them. She returned to her work as if nothing had happened. That was the role, after all, to blend in, to stay part of the background. By the time the sun dipped low and painted the hallways in gold light, her bucket was empty, her mop stored away. Before she left, she caught one last glimpse of the general. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, speaking to one of his officers. When their eyes met, he gave a single nod, nothing dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood what had been done that day. She nodded back and walked out into the fading light. There would be no medals, no speeches, no mention of her name in any report. Tomorrow, another cleaner would take her place, and life in the barracks would go on as if nothing unusual had happened. But somewhere in a classified file stored far from this base, there would be a note about the day a janitor spoke Arabic to a visiting general, and the quiet way she helped end a problem before it grew into something far worse. And for her, that was enough.